Next up we have Jen Buckingham. Jen spoke at the last Friedman conference, and when she spoke last year she was Ms. Jen Buckingham, and today when she speaks for the first time at a conference she will be Dr. Jen Buckingham. So, Jennifer has been writing about education issues for about 15 years, which she didn't want me to say because it gives away her age. But she's, I gotta say, I think probably the most prolific free market writer on education issues. And she's going to speak to us today about the missing market of for-profit schools.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So today I'm going to exploit this opportunity a bit, and although I've been collecting information on for-profit schools for a while I've been working on other things to do with schools, I really only just started to look at them closely. So my talk today is almost a collection just of thoughts, and I'm going to ask you lot to offer your insights and information, because I'm sure a lot of you know about this topic as well. And then I plan to unashamedly use them without giving you any credit when I write about it. So it would be the easiest thing for me to stand here and to slam public schools and to make sweeping statements about markets and so on. That would be too easy, so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to give you what I have found to be the unvarnished truth about for-profit schools. And that is that while they're entirely defensible in theory, and they've been very successful in developing countries, they've not quite lived up to their promise in developed countries. And I'm going to explore some of the reasons why that might be. So we all know the theoretical benefits of for-profit schools. They can attract capital more easily than non-profits. They're more responsive to demand from students and parents. They'll naturally seek the most efficient and effective ways to educate at the lowest optimum cost. They have incentives to expand into new areas and new markets instead of remaining small and local organisations. And they succeed or they fail according to their performance. So for these reasons, for-profit schools are likely to encourage innovation and diversity of provision. It's hard to think of a sector that is more desperate for and yet more resistant to innovation from entrepreneurs in education. It's very hostile to private investment and any suggestion of a profit motive, particularly in Australia. Legislation in Australia prevents for-profit schools from receiving any federal or state government funding. So that means that if they open, they have to charge parents the full cost of education provision. But they're not forbidden altogether. It is actually possible to open a for-profit school in New South Wales. And the Queensland Education Minister has recently spoken quite positively about the idea. They are illegal in Victoria, unfortunately. I've heard rumours that there are for-profit schools operating in New South Wales, but I've never actually been able to find one. So as far as I know, there are no for-profit schools running in Australia at the moment. So why is this? It's partly to do with the difficulty of entering a market where all your competitors are subsidised. But it's also to do with ideological resistance, and it seems to be particularly strong when it comes to schools. We have for-profit childcare, we have for-profit higher education, we have for-profit training colleges and tutoring centres, and there are a few objections to for-profit companies providing technology or sporting equipment, stationery, desks, pretty much anything else, books, when it comes to schools, except the schools themselves. Australia is one of the few countries in the world where this is the case. For-profit schools exist across Asia, South America, Europe, England, and of course in the United States. In the US, the introduction of charter schools just over 20 years opened the door for for-profit schools. Charter schools are notionally public schools, in that they don't charge fees, they have open enrolment policies, and they are managed under contract with the state by a private organisation. The management organisation can be either non-profit or for-profit. In 1996, in the US, there were only 6 for-profit schools. There There are now 97 for-profit educational management organisations operating 804 for-profit schools, which is around a third of all charter schools. They have 463,000 students. In Sweden, 13% of all schools are run by for-profit companies. They receive per-student funding that's equivalent to what children would receive in a public school. But like US for-profit schools, they can't charge fees. In England, their recent free schools movement or reforms allowed the establishment of for-profit schools, but there are only a small number so far. For-profit schools are proliferating though across the developing world, although it's often under the radar. These are not private schools as most people envisage them. They're private schools for the poor. These schools are widespread across Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, India, Malaysia, Indonesia, Argentina, Colombia, Pakistan and China. And that's not even the complete list. I won't go through all of the numbers in every country, but in Pakistan, for example, there are 6.3 million children in 36,000 for-profit schools. These secular for-profit schools have crowded out madrasas that were once the only option outside of public education. Another feature of for-profit schools in developing countries is they often increase the participation of girls in schools. In his travels across Africa and Asia, education researcher James Tooley discovered thousands of for-profit schools that governments were either completely ignorant about or refused to acknowledge. After visiting a country and establishing that there were private schools, he then set up a team of investigators. These teams went into slums and rural villages, sometimes in places only accessible by donkey, and found hundreds of private schools being run for profit. In many cases, they were standalone schools that had been opened by an individual who had two motives: to offer education to poor people and to provide themselves with an income. The schools Tooley and his teams visited were not even acknowledged by the education ministries, or if they were, it was only to impose unreasonable regulations that didn't even apply to public schools. There are for-profit companies operating schools in developing countries, such as the Bridge International Academy, which is the largest chain of private schools in Africa. The Bridge schools have a model called a school in a box. The school manager runs the entire school through a mobile phone, which is connected to the Bridge head office. Teachers deliver the curriculum using an e-reader, which has all of the individual lessons already preloaded and ready to go. Poor parents are willing to pay to send their children to these private schools, either because the public schools are taking away, or because they're not providing a good education. Absenteeism among public school teachers in African countries is very high, and parents can see that their children are often spending all day doing nothing. Of course, when we talk about school fees in developing countries, we're talking about different sums than we might encounter here. Fees range between $1.50 and $7 a month. This is roughly the equivalent of 5 to 10% of typical minimum wages, depending on the country and the area. This is still a pretty decent whack of people's income. But remember, this is the entire cost of running a school. No school in Australia could operate with budgets equivalent to that size. So how do the schools operate at such low cost? There's a number of factors. They often have very basic facilities. In the slums, there'll be shanty buildings. There's no electricity, no toilets, let alone interactive whiteboards and Wi-Fi. Teachers are paid much lower wages than public school teachers, and women teachers are paid much less than men. There are no costs of bureaucracy. However, schools sometimes have to bribe the government not to shut them down. There's not a great deal of data comparing the results of for-profit and public schools in Asia and Africa, partly because there's no NAPLAN, but even if there was, many schools are not even officially in existence. But the research I have seen indicates that when for-profit school students sit national external tests, they tend to outperform public school students. The strongest evidence of their quality, though, is that the poorest people in the world are willing to hand over the little money they have for their children to attend them. For-profit schools in developing and developed countries are different in many ways. In developing countries, they're truly private schools. They receive no government funding and have almost complete freedom in every aspect, accountable only to parents. In developed sector of the public school system. And I think this explains a lot. I've also uncovered surprisingly little good research that looks at the outcomes of for-profit schools in developed countries, even the US. There's plenty of research looking at charter schools in general though. The latest Centre for Research on Education Outcomes, or CREDO, study on charter schools doesn't differentiate between non-profit and for-profit. However, it finds that attendance at a charter school produces significant gains for poor students particularly, Black students and Hispanic students and English language learners, but not for white students or students who are not poor. And when I say significant gains, I mean both statistically and educationally significant. Across the 26 states studied, which included 95% of all kids in charter schools, the difference between children in charter schools and traditional public schools amounted to the equivalent of anywhere between 14 and 50 days of schooling, depending on the subgroup of students in question. When the results are broken down by geographical area, the differences are even more remarkable. In New York City and Washington DC, students in charter schools had superior reading and maths test scores equivalent to 3 months of schooling. This is not because charter schools poach the best schools from public schools. If anything, charter schools tend to take the more challenging students who are often refugees from the public school system, and that makes these results even more impressive. The most successful charter schools in America tend to be schools that have adopted an approach called no excuses. These schools are characterised by longer school days, longer school years, a rigorous traditional academic curriculum, very strong discipline policies, and teachers who work extremely long hours, often at slightly lower pay. So that is the most successful and most popular alternatives to the public education system are not new innovative educational models, but ultra-traditional, back-to-basics type schools. The exceptions to these are the virtual for-profit schools. Around 90,000 students are enrolled in virtual for-profit schools in the US. That's about 20% of all students in for-profit schools. These schools, for obvious reasons, are relatively inexpensive. They provide the entire curriculum for whatever state the family lives in online modules. The largest for-profit school network is called K-12 schools. You can either enroll in the standard version of the K-12 virtual school, which is free because it's classed as a public school, or you can pay extra to purchase the premium version with additional individual help from the teachers either online or face-to-face. The research I have seen comparing for-profit with non-profit charter schools and standard public schools finds that students in for-profit schools outperform the other students in basic skills, but not in complex skills. Again, we can only speculate on why this might be, but these are the possible reasons. Because charter schools disproportionately cater for disadvantaged students, as I said, they've often left the public school system because they can't achieve there. They have to target their teaching to fundamental basic skills. Since charter schools cannot charge fees, for-profit schools can only make a profit through making economies. In practice, this means standardising the curriculum and using pedagogies and programs that allow them to employ less experienced and therefore less costly teachers. In the US, there have been some high-profile failures of for-profit school management companies, such as Edison schools. Some people see this as a weakness, but I see it as a strength. In public schools, bad schools are not allowed to fail and close. They're continually propped up and excuses made for their poor performance. There have been some legitimate concerns, though, about for-profit management organisations, where weak regulatory environments have allowed investment companies to use for-profit schools as a means to make large windfalls in real estate investments. I read recently of one network of for-profit schools that was sending 40% of its funding for education to its real estate arm. Now, I know that the whole idea of regulation raises the hackles of some people, but I find that particular situation a bit hard to stomach. Again, as I'm only really in the process of sorting through all of this information and trying to draw the strands together to form some sort of conclusion, my thinking is this so far. I'm leaning towards the conclusion that although I'm generally in favour of a voucher system, where public funding follows the child to any school, irrespective of whether it's a public or a private school, and there seems to be no particular good reason why for-profit schools shouldn't be a part of that mix. I'm wondering about the wisdom of public funding for for-profit schools. I wonder if, in fact, public funding might undermine the promise of for-profit schools, as has happened in the US. And if perhaps they would be better funded by some sort of, through taxes or through tax exemption status, which means that people's money goes straight to the school without having to go through the government first. Those are my thoughts so far. I'm hoping that you will offer some back to me so that I can make note of them. That's all for now.